Okay, so let's get this started. A very warm welcome to the guests here in the room, but also online to our roundtable, The Future Ahead. How can society steer through the polycrisis? And probably most of you are aware this is the kick-off event of an international conference that will address this topic throughout the next 2 days, just around the corner at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS, which used to be the German Development Institute before being renamed, I think, 2 years ago. And this conference was organized and is organized by the social cohesion team at IDOS. And this team has been working on the drivers and the effects of social cohesion throughout the last 6 years almost now. And when we started this project 6 years back, social cohesion actually wasn't a big issue. But it's a big issue now. For one reason, the world went just through a pandemic and is still suffering from the effects of this pandemic. But that's not all. There are other global problems such as climate change. We observe an increasing number of wars. And unfortunately, violence has become more and more legitimate means of international politics and international relations. So world doesn't seem to be in a good state. And on top of that, we observe that societies, or some societies, are more and more polarized, meaning that their ability to cope with these global problems is decreasing and dwindling. And actually, to observe this, we don't need to go far. Here in Germany, currently the society is divided over the Hamas and Israel war. And here too in Germany, trust in state institutions decreased during the COVID pandemic because people couldn't agree, or well, at least there was unbridgeable disagreement about how to deal with this crisis, what measures to take. So a dark and pessimistic picture, actually. But at the same time, if we were all to go to the city center of Bonn in this very moment and at this hour, we would see a guy riding a horse, dressed in a very nice way, a soldier actually, with a big coat, and hundreds of children walking with lit lanterns behind this horse and the guy. And this guy would then see a poor freezing beggar. He would stop his horse, cut his coat in 2 halves, and share it with the beggar. And I'm sure that, let me say, this is an example of solidarity that is celebrated on an annual basis here in Germany. I'm sure that those of you who grew up in Germany could just think of a song that you sang, and if I would sing one, you could join me singing it, and you probably continue singing it with your kids. And this is just an example to show that there are these joint practices and traditions, values that unite us as people, as communities, as societies, on the one hand. On the other hand, these values, traditions can also be exclusive and exclude people. And that's exactly what we will talk about in this roundtable. And during the next 2 days, we will talk about how societies come together, what makes them join, what's the glue that holds them together, how do they cope with these global problems, and actually what are the patterns between these global problems, how do they affect social cohesion and the other way around. And I'm actually very honored to have the opportunity to discuss our ideas and these topics with an excellent panel of knowledgeable panelists. And as I say this, I'm not sure whether Jennifer can hear us and is with us. She is. Perfect. Hi, Jennifer. So all of you have studied social cohesion, and you're working on every day very hard to find policy solutions to these problems that I just talked about. And let me introduce our panelists. So the first one I'd like to introduce is Jennifer McCoy. You see her online. You should see her. Yeah, you do, up here above me. Jennifer is the Regents Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University and non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she studies, amongst many other things, democratic resilience, partisan polarization, crisis prevention, and conflict resolution. And if I may say so, Jennifer, you have really become one of the authorities in the study of polarization. So we're really very, very honored that you're here sharing your insights from your research with us. The second panelist will join us with a video. It's Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and member of the Club of Rome and co-author of Earth for All. And Jayati actually tried to make everything possible to be here, but she has to travel between India and the US, and we just lost against the time zone. And so she will join us with a video, but she would have really liked to be here with us. To my right, Joseph Asunka, the CEO of Afrobarometer, and you were previously, and actually when I read that, program officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I got to know you when you just came to Afrobarometer from that position, and I think we can all be lucky, and it's a really good thing that you came back to research, joining Afrobarometer and leading Afrobarometer, because it's not only research that you provide as an institution, it's really policy and society relevant research, and what you do is going far beyond collecting data, and I'm probably understating the case when I say that this work not only inspires researchers, but also guides the work of governments, NGOs, and international organizations. And we are really happy that we have you as a partner in our project. And we actually couldn't have done our work, especially the measurement of social cohesion, without the data of Afrobarometer. So thanks a lot. Heriberto, to my left, Patty actually has the longer official job description, so yours is still shorter. You're the Research and Strategic Partnership Advisor of the Human Development Report Office at the UN. You're leading both of these areas, and you've been doing that or been a senior member of the Human Development Report Office since 2014. So you bring along a lot of insights on human development and how human development, social development matters, and I think it's great that you will bring in all these different connections to global policy debates, because that's what your reports have been doing. They shaped debates on global development and were very, very influential. And I'm grateful that we have been in touch and exchanging. And maybe if we are lucky, we get a small sneak preview on some of the results and insights from the next Human Development Report, which will be out soon, in November, December? Soon. And last but not least, Patrick Barron. So now that's the long description. The World Bank's global lead for social cohesion and resilience and acting lead for community and local development within the social sustainability and inclusion global practice at the World Bank. So it sounds like a lot of work and a lot of responsibility. And I'm really grateful that we have been cooperating during the last years and initiated a webinar series on social cohesion. which gave practitioners the opportunity to exchange on the topic. That's one thing, but I'm also grateful that you're here with all the impressive experience and research that the job practitioners experience on Asia. You worked a lot in very different Asian contexts, also on fertility, conflict, and violence, but also a lot of research that will probably help us to find solutions, because that's the idea of this roundtable. We will start with the problems. So the first half of this roundtable is about the patterns, about how social cohesion and global problems are linked, how they interact. But then we want to also change perspectives and talk about a future, a positive future, and what it could look like, what policy solutions could be. So without further ado, I'll start with that more problematic look before we then in the second half turn to the future solutions. And I'd like to start with a question. So maybe that, because we are all aware how we will go about this, but you are not. So let me just say that we will have one round with the panelists on the problems. Then we will share the message or the presentation of Yayati, which will give a picture of the future already and describe some pathways. And then we have another round with the panelists here on this positive look towards the future and the solutions. And then you've got the opportunity to also come in and comment and ask your questions. And this is really meant to be an open conversation, because I'm afraid we don't have all the solutions yet. So Jennifer, let me start with you and the question: what are major trends and patterns of social tensions or polarization in societies around the globe, and how are they linked to global problems? Because that's really at the core of your work. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. I hope the communication works okay from across the pond. I'm sorry I couldn't travel in person. Yes, polarization and severe polarization is rising around the world in all regions. And this is a serious problem. It is also correlated with an erosion or a backsliding of democracy. So we think there is some link. There's a lot of work going on to look at the causal mechanisms. And it's a problem for all the things we're talking about here today. It's a severe problem because I think it's underlying our inability to address the other pressing policy problems that we face in the world without the ability to come together to talk, to communicate, to negotiate, compromise, and find solutions. We cannot solve all of our pressing problems. So this problem of polarization affects governance generally. It is certainly affecting social cohesion, and it is affecting governability. So the capacity to find solutions to pressing problems. In my work, also with Murat Somer from Turkey, we identify kind of 4 fault lines of polarization that we are seeing in countries around the world. Some countries may only have 1, some may have all 4. For example, the United States, we think, has all 4. So I want to talk about those because I think these are the underlying issues that we can diagnose to determine the strength of our democratic resilience to the stressors that we're all facing, all the governance, the global governance kinds of stressors. So this first area is agreement on the membership of the political community, which basically means who is deemed a rightful citizen and a full citizen in any particular democracy. And we're seeing a weakening of this agreement on the boundaries or the membership, the boundaries of the political community, who should be a member. And this is there are a number of reasons this is happening, but this is really directly hurting social cohesion as different groups and are pitted in political rhetoric by political entrepreneurs. They're described and pitted against each other as illegitimate actors in the polity, in democracy, and they're shown as enemies of the country. So no longer just adversaries, difference of political opinion, we'll see who wins this time around, but actually as enemies to be defeated, to be vanquished, to be excluded. So this is a major problem. The second arena that can turn into a fault line of polarization is when we have a weakening of the agreement on the rules of the political game. And so this is really talking about what are the democratic rules that we are agreeing to? What are the arrangements we've agreed to? And in most democracies, we at one point have a general agreement, usually a written constitution, and general agreement on what are the electoral rules and this kind of thing. We're seeing that question today in many countries, and we're seeing distrust, lack of confidence in the basic process of elections arising in certain countries. And this is a fundamental problem. But we also see divisions over whether we should define democracy as majority rules, and that's it. Whoever wins the majority is going to make the decisions, or whether we're going to also emphasize what we would consider the liberal aspects of democracy, the checks and balances, the accountability, a diffusion of power in this sense. So we have some differences over even what kind of democracy we want. And then the third area is what I would call the social contract. And when we see in certain countries the terms of the social contract no longer agreed upon, when some groups view others as breaching that social contract, then we have a rise in polarization. And so that is what I mean by that is what is the collective responsibility that we agree citizens should have toward each other, and particularly that the state should have toward the citizens? What is that collective responsibility? And we see a lot of belief polarization over this and a weakening of agreement on the social contract. So, for example, in Latin America, we see a lot of protests around social justice, around inequality, around the market model of privatization as being exclusionary towards some groups. And so if we have difference of opinion on that collective responsibility, then we're going to see polarization. And the fourth area is, in fact, agreement, whether we have agreement on the degree of acceptable inequality. So there's always going to be some level of income and wealth inequality, or some inequality even in opportunity. But generally, democracies have agreed that at least we want to aim toward certainly political equality of citizens, but also equality of opportunity, even if not of outcomes. Yet there's differences of opinion over how much inequality is acceptable. And as we have seen skyrocketing income gaps, income inequality, and wealth inequality rising around the world, then this is a serious problem. And it may have an indirect effect on both polarization, democracy, support for more autocratic leaders or more populist messages, but that effect is there. And this is the fourth arena that I think we need to look at. So that's my general diagnosis of the areas, the threats that are giving rise to severe or toxic polarization, what I call pernicious polarization, on one or more of these issues in different countries of the world.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer, for describing these four patterns of polarization and how societies more and more disengage and disintegrate. Let me turn now a bit more to the mix of the social or national and global level and ask you, Heriberto, that, as I just said, your office is currently preparing the next edition of the Human Development Report. And what are major challenges that you identify for societies nowadays, and how do they affect the ability of societies to shape a sustainable future?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the invitation to IDOS. So on your question, we have identified what we call the uncertainty complex, because for us it's important to be able to understand the context. And in this uncertainty complex, we have different layers of uncertainty that are quite unprecedented. One of them, which is very important, is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is this moment in human history where we are actually, some people say, in geological history, in which humans are affecting the planet in a very fundamental way. So this is climate change, the biodiversity loss, zoonotic diseases, etc. This is already happening. We can see it, and it's going to intensify. Second, we have many other processes of social adjustment. Some of them are coming from new technologies, some conflicts, also some transitions in energy, etc. And third, we see the process of polarization that Jennifer was describing. That it's widespread, it's a wave. So in short, we are in a situation, probably everyone here will say the same, a version of the same. We are in a situation where we need to act together, and precisely now we are more divided than ever. So this is very problematic. So, but there is another element that I would like to stress here, is that at the same time that we are facing this uncertainty, we people are feeling very insecure. In our office, we talk a lot about human insecurity. So this is a complement to other views of national security. So what happens to people? And we see that in the world, 6 out of 7 people feel insecure. And not only that, the feelings of insecurity are increasing around the world for the countries for which we have information. And not only that, the feelings of insecurities are increasing even in countries that are relatively developed. So then the question is, why? So in part, this has to do with the fact that our institutions are not fit for purpose for the new uncertainties. But at the same time, it looks like part of this feeling of insecurity has to do with something unexpected. So we are finally at this point reaching the highest level of human development according to how we measure human development index. So we have unprecedented levels of wealth, education, health, technology, but suddenly we are feeling more insecure. So there is something that is not expected. So it's like we have ceased to understand the world, as the title of a book. And I think this is deeply unsettling. And our research shows that when people feel insecure, then a lot of problems emerge. So the level of trust drop, interpersonal trust drop very significantly. For us, it's the main driver of interpersonal trust. On the other hand, people who feel insecure, in particular in countries that are relatively developed, and in particular among those who are better off in the top of the distribution, then people change their views about very fundamental things. For instance, they tend to support less democracy. They tend to justify more violent means of political action. So 2 points that I think we need to address is, first, of course, address change the institutions for the needs of the 21st century. But second, we need to pay more attention to what's going on with people and their security, which is something that we haven't been measuring consistently. So we propose that this has to be one of the key areas of attention for policymakers from now on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Already solution driven. So so we have heard about the different patterns of polarization, a lack of agreement in societies as a whole, and you shifted a bit to the individual level, talking about uncertainties of individuals and human insecurity. And I think that's a great bridge to Afrobarometer's work, Joe. So what does Afrobarometer data tell us about the perception of citizens, of the effects of global problems on African societies? How do they perceive these effects? And are there specific challenges that differ from what we have just heard from the other panelists?
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Julian. Thanks to IDOS for inviting Afrobarometer. Thank you all for making it. In terms of the global challenges, I don't think of course, these challenges do not know national boundaries, and so they certainly impact Africa just as much as they impact the rest of the world. Even for some of those that seem unique to the continent, all of those still have ripple effects on the global system. So there is that feedback between what happens on the continent that has ripple effects across the globe, and then what happens globally, affecting people on the continent. But let me just touch on two things. The first has been described here, democratic decline, because the declining levels of democracy has not spared the continent. And this we have been recording in our data since we started in 1999. So for those who don't know Afrobarometer, we are a Pan-African Survey Research Network. We work in about 40 countries across the continent where we gather public opinions and experience about citizens' interactions with the public system and with governments and social interactions and how they assess those, especially their governments and their government's responsiveness to their demands. I mean, the good news is that Africans continue to support democracy. They want to live under governments that are democratic and accountable. And so even though we talk about this erosion of democracy, the gradual decline of democracy on the continent, on the demand side, citizens don't seem to be winning. They want more democracy. They want governments that are accountable. They are still committed to the core democratic institutions, including elections, media freedom, and all the institutions they can imagine that are associated with democratic governance. The challenge has been the supply side. And so we do see governments increasingly not being able to meet the democratic aspirations of their citizens. So we have lots of Africans say they are not satisfied with the way democracy works, and they don't even describe their countries as a democracy. So in some countries, only a small majority will say that their country is a democracy. So we do see that for the issue of democratic decline mentioned here, it's not on the demand side, it's on the supply side. The governments are not delivering and are not meeting their citizens' aspirations. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to mention is on climate change. That is becoming increasingly a big challenge on the continent at the moment. We have been asking citizens about their experience with extreme weather conditions, and this has been growing over the time. We've seen that more and more people saying that they're experiencing extreme weather conditions, whether it is droughts or floods or mudslides and the like. And so we have been recording these over time. It's just that not many, it's only a slim majority of respondents or people on the continent who understand or know about the term climate change. And so even though they are feeling the effects, knowledge about the phenomenon itself is not as widespread. And so we have roughly about 50% on the continent knowing what the phenomenon is, even though we have large majorities telling us about the effects of extreme weather conditions on the continent. And so in general, as I said, all of these global trends, and I could have mentioned several of them, but democratic decline and climate change in particular are issues of big concern on the continent. Of course, insecurity is also being picked up now on the continent as well, but partly because of people's, the inability of governments to deliver on democratic norms, we see that there has been this increasing attraction to military rule on the continent. So if you look 10 years ago, how the extent to which Africans resisted military rule has softened over time. And so now when we asked the last time around whether or not the military should come in if your elected leaders abuse power, and we have actually a majority, about 53% of Africans saying yes, the military should come in if elected leaders abuse power. What we are most concerned about is that this view or this sentiment is much stronger among young people on the continent, which is concerning because this is a continent of very young people. And so when you have the young people thinking that the military should intervene, and they are not saying they should intervene because they want the military, it's just that their leaders are failing to deliver what they want to see. And so I'll stop here with the challenges. I will talk about the solutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Actually, this is a finding that other world regions share as well. So where support for democracy is high, it's low amongst the young population, which, since we want to talk about the future as well, is probably a worrying trend. And also, if you listen, to the three of you, democracy as it stands doesn't seem to be the answer. So probably democracy needs to change as well. And I think it's an interesting observation with climate change, because even if people are not aware of the global dimension of the problem, but of the effects, probably adaptation will be a game changer for adaptation or non-adaptation for social cohesion in many countries of the continent. So we learned a lot and talked a lot about political issues, insecurity and security. Let us turn a bit more to the social dimension and social development, as the World Bank is one of the major funders of programs fostering and supporting social development. Paddy, what is your take? What are the challenges for social cohesion that you see from both a financing but also a social perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and thank you to the IDOS team for inviting me. It's great to be here. Many of my comments, I think, will echo those of colleagues. This is what you get when you go last in a discussion. I think we're at a point in time which is unprecedented in the modern era in terms of challenges to the social fabric. We know that great transformations and change create insecurity at the individual level, at the community, at the societal level. We know this from history and behavioral science. We also know that they create winners and losers and contestation. And I think the changes we're seeing over the past decades are, in terms of reordering the economy and social relations, at a level probably we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. On the one hand, we have climate change, which is leading to vast impacts on people's lives. But on the other hand, we also have the adaptation and mitigation response, which also won't necessarily lead to big changes in people's lives. Now, that can be positive, but from a social perspective, that creates many challenges as well. And so both climate change and our necessary responses to it are going to create winners and losers and going to create uncertainty and insecurity. At the same time, we see the technological revolution. Here, I'm not just talking about AI, but that's obviously very important. Elon Musk telling the British Prime Minister this week that work as we know it will disappear in the next 2 decades. But even before that, the ubiquity of access to the internet from handheld devices. And this, again, creates changes, heightens expectations, people are no longer happy to live the lives they did before often. They learn about how others live. Before, maybe they only knew about how people around them lived. And again, this can be a great force for good. The information people can get can be a great force for good, but can also create immense challenges as well. And I think what we see now, which again differentiates from previous periods, is not only do we have these big changes, but we have these new spaces for communication, where people can easily communicate and reach thousands, millions of people with narratives of their choosing, sometimes informed, sometimes not so informed. And again, that's a double-edged sword. In many ways, that's democratizing life. But as we all know, the echo chambers of social media, the way in which political entrepreneurs can seize upon this for non-savory political goals and so on. And so I think this puts us in almost in a despairing place. And I think, I'm going to get onto some solutions later on. But I think the big challenge is unpacking what we mean by social cohesion and polarization. We're talking about so many different things between so many different groups over so many issues that will vary from context to context between different people at the same time. And that, what do we do in terms of entry points, right? I think we're now quite far in thinking through what we can do at the community level, perspective-taking work, bringing together different communities. That's shown to be effective, but at the same time, we're seeing wider political polarization across different areas. I think we're seeing what I'd call multi-polarization, right? This is not a polarization, Cold War, communist capitalism. This is polarization over multiple issues at the same time. And so I think that's our challenge, right? Our challenge is to get our head around that and think through what are the entry points for dealing with these different things. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, two points. The first one, I'm grateful that you brought in the effects on the economy and that there is a reordering taking place that affects the economy, because in debates on social cohesion, often in debates on global development, we do not talk a lot about business. We actually do in our project, and I see some of the champions of our financing work here in the first. Well, seeing with the light is saying too much, but I can guess that Vibal is there and Tekalin. And the second observation, I think, is a very important one, because our ideas of social cohesion, as we shared them here, and the ideas of polarization that you shared, Jennifer, are very much bound to nations or communities. They have a very territorial, geographic, they have a location, so to speak. But then when I hear you talking about digitalization, about polarization, that is not East-West anymore, but it's people around the globe gather on specific topics across regions, and you will find transnational activism. So this is certainly something we need to think about as well in our work, and when we think about the future, actually, and that's what I'd like to invite us to do now, and by first listening to a video message of Yayati, who will talk about the Earth for All model. That's a model of several scenarios that the Club of Rome, or group of authors of the Club of Rome, developed. You probably know it. It's a fantastic webpage. You can design, follow the different pathways to the future. So it's really worth looking at it. And why we invited colleagues from the Earth for All group, because they, for the first time, model a social tension index and integrate it into their future or in their scenarios. So let's say what Yayati has to tell us. Let's see, what she has to tell us. And yeah, perfect.
We know that we are in a period of social, economic, and ecological breakdown. And we know that this is generating unprecedented conflict, contradiction, and lack of social cohesion. and also that this is unsustainable, that humanity is really standing on the edge of a precipice. So what do we do to deal with the dysfunctional polarization that we see in our societies, the growing food and energy insecurity, the climate change, ecological collapse that are already becoming evident in wars and in other kinds of conflict within countries and across countries? It's evident that we really have to think of a completely different way of dealing with this. And this is what we have tried to do in the Transformational Economic Commission of the Club of Rome. We have produced a report that is called Earth for All. And it is really designed to provide a big breakthrough for people and planet by recognizing the extreme contradictions under which we currently exist and how we are on a path to destruction, but also recognizing that we can change this. It can be done. And so we have argued that it is necessary to have what we have called 5 extraordinary turnarounds to reduce the impact of all of the multiple crises that we see, to turn this around, to also bring back some minimal social cohesion, some semblance of social and economic justice that will enable our societies to function. We have seen in the last 30 years sustained or increasing poverty, especially increasing poverty in the last few years. We have seen dramatic increases in inequality, which have reduced the legitimacy of political systems. And that in turn has given rise to various kinds of social tension. And all of this is, of course, worsened by climate shocks. Now, we know that when there is no social cohesion, you get all kinds of unpleasant social and political effects. We have seen democratic backsliding in so many countries and the rise of fascistic tendencies. We've seen the growth of authoritarianism, growing conflicts over nature and resources. We are arguing that we can actually address all of these problems through 5 major turnarounds. These turnarounds are to eliminate poverty, to reduce inequality, to empower women and other disadvantaged groups, to transform our currently dysfunctional food systems, and to transform energy systems with much greater reliance on renewable energy and on electrification of much more of our economic activities. Now, all this may sound utopian or too severe or major, but we have outlined the ways in which you can get there. There are specific policies that governments can undertake. There are specific ways in which we can act to reduce the contradictions that are generating so much social tension. And these various measures we have defined in detail in each of the 5 turnarounds. But together, they can actually stop this dramatic rush to destruction for people and planet that we are observing at the moment, and which is expressed so clearly in very significantly increased social tensions. These changes are doable, they are viable. The question is to make them politically necessary and politically so urgent that governments are forced to respond. And that is why Earth for All is not just an analysis, it's not just another book talking about the crises and how to deal with them. We see this as a call for action. We see this as a way in which people across the world can get together and work together towards the policies that will reduce these multiple contradictions and to bring back social cohesion.
Yeah, so virtuals, thank you to the video message and Yayati. Viable changes that need to be made politically urgent. I mean, we just heard here in our round that it's not easy because political communities are breaking apart. But we want to give it a try and really think ahead. And we want to start with, as you said, the continent that populates the youngest population around the globe. So from what you heard, Joe, what do African citizens perceive as a desirable future? Is there something Afrobarometer data can tell us about this? And what are the strengths that help societies to overcome social tensions?
All right, thank you so much for that, and thanks. I think the other panelists touched on some of these issues, but First of all, just to highlight or re-emphasize what I mentioned earlier, Africans want to live under governments that are democratic and accountable. That has always been a commitment since 1999. We started surveying on the continent. That has been a consistent message. Increasingly, Africans also want their governments to take immediate action to limit the effects of climate change, because it's becoming more and more relevant and salient in their lives. And so that is the key thing. Those are the two issues that I want to mention. But beyond that, to think about solutions going forward, let me start with the issue of public trust. And I know you had mentioned the issue of public trust and how it undermines social cohesion. In our data, what we're finding is two levels of trust. One, institutional and the trust in democratic institutions and elected leaders. And then the second part, talking about generalized trust in society, trust of neighbors and the like. What we've seen is the key drivers of trust in public institutions is the extent of perceived corruption. So when there's a lot of perceived corruption, especially in the presidency, it brings down institutional trust drastically. And that has implications for social cohesion, because once institutional trust begins to drop, how people will act collectively, even to think about engaging with governments and making sure that governments are responsive, can break down, and that has that general implications for advancing or at least consolidating democratic institutions. The second piece, then driver is, and you just mentioned that, insecurity. So in our data set, we often ask people, do you feel secure walking in your neighborhood? And people who tell us they feel insecure walking in their own neighborhoods tend to have less trust in their neighbors, and even to the extent of trusting the police less, and they trust institutions less. And so the dual effects of having high levels of corruption and high levels of insecurity then means that it dampens public trust across the board, both institutions and social trust. And these are the variables that we find in our data set that actually drives down social trust. And we do believe that now working on issues of especially anti-corruption, effective anti-corruption actions that can limit corruption would be very valuable in promoting social trust and enhancing social cohesion. The second piece, of course, being security, because if there's effective policing and people feel more secure in their neighborhoods, then increasingly you're likely to get more trust in society. And that could also lead to greater incentives to act collectively, to hold governments accountable. Because as at the moment, for communities where there's a lot of fear in terms of just living in your own neighborhood, when people are insecure, acting collectively with others to hold governments accountable becomes a problem. And so these two effects can have those negative impacts on the advancement and consolidation of democracy. And I think that dealing with insecurity, dealing with issues of corruption can be very effective. But the second one I want to mention, which I'm glad Jayati mentioned it, is gender inequality. And so we've been asking questions on gender equality on the continent. The last time we asked Africans, what is the greatest or the highest women's rights issue on the continent that needs to be addressed? And the top one that came up was gender-based violence. So across the continent, this was the number one issue, gender rights, women's rights issue. The second one immediately following that was too few women in positions of leadership. And so these are the two top issues, policy issues on the continent, which can also have the general effects of gender disparities on the continent. And that is largely because when we talk of gender-based violence and how people perceive it in the households, of course, generally people think it's a criminal matter, but it's not the same across all the countries. There are some countries where it is not seen as a criminal matter, and that is gender-based violence. But the disparities in terms of access and opportunity, women consistently lag behind men. And I think the issue of addressing inequality, that is a big issue on the continent. And Africans, of course, that actually reflects in our data that we see these gaps between the two genders, but it also has a regional effect because It's not just the gender gaps, but we see that in some regions, especially in West Africa and North Africa, the gender gaps in certain areas are much bigger than they are in Southern Africa and East Africa. But these are the points that we try to highlight, and then figuring out the best ways that we can tackle that kind of inequality on the continent can be very useful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I probably shouldn't say it, but so far you've been the most disciplined panel I ever moderated. Everybody sticks to the time, so just stick to that. Great. Yeah, I think it's great because you addressed the two dimensions of social cohesion, Joe, right? The horizontal dimension, where it's about people to people, the gender issue, but then also the vertical dimension. You mentioned insecurity and corruption, and the relationship between state and society. And based on that, I would like to ask you, Jennifer, because in your research, you identify measures and dynamics that help societies to overcome polarization and social tension, and on both dimensions as well. So it would be great if you could share some of your insights with us.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, this is exactly right. We have, and when we're talking about polarization as well, and the associated lack of confidence in public institutions and in interpersonal trust, we do look at generally the elite level, which are political leaders, elected officials, social leaders, organized interests, and then the voter level. And those are interlinked. But generally, when we see these vulnerabilities that I had mentioned earlier, the four arenas of vulnerability, it is political entrepreneurs who exploit those and for political purposes, to try to win power or to keep power. And so they are causing, with their polarizing and denigrating rhetoric, political rhetoric, this extending the sense of polarization within the society and among the voters. And so I think it is sort of top down in that sense. And so I think that, the first key thing is that we need to shift from a zero sum to a positive sum perception of the game. And when people do see it as a zero sum game, when they're seeing themselves or others excluded, when they're seeing rising inequality, all of these things we've been talking about, then they are going to feel this anxiety, this insecurity that Heriberto was talking about earlier. And so if we can shift the rhetoric, if we can shift to more inclusive rhetoric with respect and dignity, and address through the policy options that have been proposed already, which are excellent, that Jayati proposed, and these two broad areas that Joseph just talked about, the corruption and the crime and personal insecurity, which is also huge in Latin America right now. Huge, huge issue. So we need to address the policy areas. We have to address the inequality and the well-being. If we can do that, that will shift to a more positive sum game. But it often becomes a chicken and egg problem. And it's the politicians who are there pursuing the polarizing, divisive rhetoric, unwilling to work together domestically as well as globally. And I'm glad we brought in the global problem of collective action. And so we've got to change the incentives for those political leaders. In some countries, that might mean institutional reform, participatory innovations. I know that in Earth for All, they're focusing on citizens' assemblies, for example, which I think is excellent. Changing electoral rules. So there are a number of specifics in there that could help. But to change these incentives for political leaders is going to take major grassroots efforts and the efforts of organized interest groups and social and political leaders, influencers. from media, from faith communities, from the arts, from culture. So, and from business is very important. So it is a multifaceted approach that's going to be required. And in the long term, I just want to suggest that we need more civic education. And we're seeing, in the United States, we see just very poor knowledge just about how government works. What is a public good or a collective good even? Why do we need taxes? The taxes aren't just stealing, your money, which the voters often hear. So we need better civic education, but also that can focus on the skills of civil discourse, but try to create a shared narrative, a shared national story, and a shared understanding of democratic institutions, how they actually work. What is the role and the responsibility of the individual citizen as well? What is the social contract? And can we find a shared national history to teach our children? So it's a long-term issue, a long-term problem, but I think that the youth is the hope, although we do see contradictions, and we just heard about that from Joseph in Africa, about support for potential military to intervene. They're so dissatisfied. We've seen youth in countries like Argentina, like Turkey, supporting outsider kind of burn it all down type candidates, particularly right-wing candidates, when the youth are so frustrated of years of declining economic opportunity and see no hope. Then they will turn, to very disruptive outsider candidates. But we also see them. We just saw young women coming out and really seeming to carry the vote in Poland for a change. We saw that in the United States in the last 2 years. That women were extremely important in the last vote that we had, and particularly young women. So it's a double-edged sword. I think we've got to encourage young people to participate and to work rather than become alienated from politics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Before proceeding, let me invite the online participants to, if you have questions, to already start to think about them and fill in the online document where you can raise your questions that I will then read out. Patty, we heard a lot about local, national, etc. solutions. At the same time, a lot of the problems seem to be global, in a sense that we need global rules and at least global agreement on what an attainable future could look like. So my question is, for somebody working at the World Bank, what could be the World Bank's contribution to such a debate on an attainable future on the one hand, and on the other hand, what does the World Bank do to foster social cohesion then in societies?
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yeah, and just to point out again, I think, international institutions can do a lot. The World Bank can work on part of the agenda, but not the full agenda, right? So we don't work on the politics of countries. Some of the UN agencies are able to do that more. So I'll just talk a little bit about the socioeconomic development side. I think at the bank, we've had a bit of a wake-up call, actually. We just have a new president. And what typically happens when a president comes in is we have a kind of cosmetic organizational restructuring. There's a couple of kind of pet ideas or thematic areas that get pushed a bit. But there's a real feeling that it's a bit different this time. And I think that's because a lot of the bank's stakeholders on the board, principally the US, but beyond as well, has been saying we have to reform ourselves in major ways. So we're in this process, it's called the Evolution Roadmap. And already we've seen the goals of the World Bank be changed. So it used to be end extreme poverty and increase shared prosperity, which is essentially an inequality measure. To that has been added on a livable planet. And this is acknowledging that it's not only about poverty reduction, but it's also about creating the conditions for humans to prosper in the wider array of things that are important. that, of course, relates to climate, but it also relates to insecurity and conflict and fragility as well. There's also talk of the bank potentially doubling its financing capacity because of the nature and the scale of these problems, and to go beyond our work, which is normally at the country level, to start to work on broader global public goods, both in terms of financing, but also as a mechanism for convening different views from civil society, government, and so on getting common approaches going forward. So I feel we have a moment of opportunity here. And I kind of feel part of my job is to try and make sure that as these changes are happening, that social cohesion and building trust between people is kind of at the center of this agenda. Again, just from a kind of personal point of view, some of the things that my unit's trying to do, which is not all the answers, but hopefully can help. So over the next decade, we are going to see trillions of dollars of climate financing. Private, government, through the bank, through bilaterals, and so on. And I think the challenge here is not just to get that right in terms of having positive climate effects, but to use that to try and build social sustainability more broadly, to build resilience, to build social cohesion and inclusion as well, and to do so in a way that people feel is legitimate. We have a big opportunity here. Think about the potential positive co-benefits from a social cohesion perspective if that money is spent well on projects that are designed to take these things into account. One of my roles is acting as our lead on community and local development projects. Now, these are essentially projects where money goes down in block grants to the community level, and you have a participatory process to decide how to use that money. This is $45 billion in active portfolio at the moment across almost every developing country in the world, including those affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. And what I've found is that many of the project documents talk about how we can build social cohesion through these activities by bringing people together and decision-making and so on. But actually, when you actually look at their design, there's not really specific activities in there that maybe relate to the specific social cohesion problems in a given context. So for example, they may bring community members within a village together, whereas actually the problem is inter-village relations. And so what we're trying to do as well is start to think through how we can use these projects as platforms to try out a range of different things for bolstering social cohesion. And then the third and final thing I think we really need to do forward is to push the learning agenda. And by learning, I mean understanding better the issues, but also drawing lessons learned and evaluating different responses that we've done. And I think on all of these areas, we really need to work in partnership. There's things the bank can bring, there's things the UN can bring, there's things agencies like IDOS and bilaterals and CSOs and NGOs can bring. And we need to find ways to partner with each other. The bank has immense financing capacity and has other strengths. Academia, think tanks have the intellectual and the academic capacity to bring things. CSOs have the networks on the ground and often the local knowledge. So I think this is the challenge for us going forward and the opportunity as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And now the call to the audience here. There's only one speaker in between your opportunity to raise questions and make comments, in addition, of course, to the online questions. And tomorrow, Patty, we will have, as you know, a panel on the impact of social cohesion measures with colleagues from different backgrounds, from different organizations. So we hope that this can be a continued learning process. But now let me turn to you, Heriberto, and because you work at the very heart of global institutions at UN. So what is your perspective on the prospects for shaping a positive and sustainable future? Because I mean, there are also a lot of tensions in the UN system at the moment. And do you think that the UN as an organization can contribute to foster social cohesion. I know by definition you have to say yes, given your job description, but maybe you're invited to be critical as well.
Thank you. First, a couple of points that I think can give us hope in this context. First is to realize, and this is building on what Yayati was saying, that most of the big problems that we are facing, climate change, conflicts, the new threats from technologies, are human-made. And therefore, it is up to us, in theory, to change things around. And I think it's important to have that in mind. Certainly, no single actor alone, no single country alone, or company or group can address this, but potentially we can address the issues. The second point is that uncertainty, this uncertainty complex, doesn't have to be only a bad thing. Uncertainty also offers opportunities, the ability to do new things. We in our office and in the UNDP and the UN, we are trying to push this more positive framing as well, and the need to. We're talking about the enhancing the 3 I's: investment, insurance, and innovation. Investment in a broad sense in human development, because in order to change things around, we need to make decisions, collective decisions, and that implies to act today to try to shape the future. In the case of insurance, this is critical for addressing the issue of insecurity. And here, a key element is solidarity, and in particular, global solidarity. I will talk a little bit about that in a second. And innovation, not because we think that we have to be voluntaristic and wait for magical solutions to emerge, is on the contrary, to recognize, to be humble, to recognize that things are changing, that some institutions that might have worked in the past need to be changed in order to be fit for purpose now and in the future. So, and of course, in this space, we think that the UN has a big role to play. It's true that there are tensions that are significant in the work of the UN and other multilateral organizations, but this is in part reflecting the tensions that exist in the world. And to some extent, even though there are things that we need to change, it's good that this conversation is taking place within the UN. I think we shouldn't take for granted the UN. We need to value what we have. I know it's unbiased, but we have been discussing with historians, for instance, recently to try to understand what's going on now based on evidence from past decades. And it's very interesting to look at the experience of the League of Nations. So it was an organization that had a lot of support, some achievements, but it wasn't able to avoid World War II. So the fact that we have now 193 members and the space to discuss things is important for social cohesion at the global level. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or more recently, to have agreed on an agenda for development, for the 2030 development agenda, the Paris Agreement. These are important benchmarks, and I think we need to build on those. But at the same time, I think this is a time to look for reforms. But I hope that these reforms don't come from us, right? Those who are working there, we are custodians. This is something that needs to come from society. And I think this is a key problem, that I see there is a big gap between what the UN is doing and what people think they can contribute to what the UN is doing. The world is changing. For instance, it used to be the case that many of the discussions at the global level were about transferring resources from richer countries to poorer countries. And in part, this is one of the things that the UN helps to do. But now that the problems are happening also in developed countries, changes everything. These are common problems that demand a different type of conversation. Therefore, the UN has to be able to adapt to this different type of dynamics. So I think the bigger message here is that the UN has a big role, but also it's important to create a new sense of ownership, and this is the invitation.
Thank you, Heribert. Does it work, the mic? It doesn't, right? I mean, you can hear me here, but online probably not. No, I was told we are not allowed to change colors. Thank you. Orange, from red to orange, at least the IDOS logo colors. Yeah, thanks a lot, Heriberto. So that's a different type of financing adaptation, actually, because the UN has also funding problems, right? So it's also an invitation if the UN needs to adapt to finance UN adaptation as well. And I'm not so sure whether this was the most positive outlook on the future, but it's one that helps us, of course, to think about global institutions as well. But let me now turn to the audience here, and we already have 3 to 4 questions online. I would invite you here first, and then go to the online questions and collect 4 to 5 questions, and then give it back to the panel, and then see whether we have time for another round, if there are questions, comments in the room. So I see 2, one in the back and here in the front.
Thank you very much, the moderator and presenters, for very clear, at the same time very informative sharing of knowledge, as well as, of course, experience. I've got a comment and 2 questions. The comment is that I thought context is key in any decision making, particularly if we are talking about social cohesion. It seems to be dependent upon the cultural, the normative, the psychological makeup of the entire society. And I think that should be given, that is the embedment at the background. It is this that has held society for generations. But when the time brings different challenges, then how they can cope with that seems to my understanding, my experience, seems to be sort of food for thought. So this is just the role of context as we do. And now the questions are, where is the role of indigenous knowledge? And of course, all of you alluded to local partnership, not simply top-down, but a bottom-up approach as well has some space. But still, I really like, particularly from the World Bank and maybe UN approach, based on the experience of SAP, Structural Adjustment Program, what it made in Africa, particularly in Uganda and many other areas. Just recommendations made, and finally what happened, I think we know from history. So is there any space to accommodate those differences, or still are we driving from top down, take what I give you, and still go my way as the only way? I think that isn't it sort of a challenge. Number two, my second question is, we are now in this world, particularly in this century, we happen to witness multipolar world, and so the tension of this multipolarity, say China, Russia, many others, really, and India, the Asian aspect having an alternative, and the West also having another alternative. Now the tension is growing. So how can these tensions could possibly be addressed before you make your own, as you already mentioned, sort of adjustment or reform in the UN? How do you see it? Same is true, of course, from Africa and Latin America as well. There are voices so as to maintain global social cohesion. So these are just two questions for you to reflect, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And this was our dear colleague, Professor Jonas Adeto from the University of Addis Ababa, and also a member of the Ethiopian Peace Commission. So for the following speakers, please introduce yourself and be short. But I have a question here online, which relates directly to your question, Jonas, and that is to all speakers actually. What is the impact of conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine on social cohesion around the world, both regionally and globally? It speaks to the last question on multipolarity. Given the time, I suggest that we take two more questions here and then the questions online. So I saw one more hand here in the back and in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Girma Kalboro. I'm coming from this neighborhood Center for Development Research, University of Bonn. It was a very informative presentation from the participants, and also moderation was fantastic for me. In my view, especially based on my research in Sub-Saharan Africa, these global local connections are very important. And secondly, on the local level, we have a lot of changes taking place. Urbanization, also migration is there also because of this. A lot of information about economic opportunities in the urban areas or regional mobilities from country to country is very, very common. What I see is that we have been from the top down, always there is a policy. It can be from global to local or from national to local. Solutions that are designed ideally, imagining some ideal future for different areas. And these policies are formulated and strategies are developed to implement in those areas. For example, based on my research, conservation, national parks, or rural development programs, all are designed. And if we look at the papers, they are very nice, but they are taken to the local context, and it is even making the problem worse than before. Excluding people from conservation areas is making them poorer, and then enmity is developed between conservation institutions and communities. With urbanization, there is also a great divide between urban dwellers and rural people. And with urbanization, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, it is taking place fast, and eviction is very common, and then people are becoming enemies always, and because these poor people are becoming beggars in city areas, in city centers, and it is becoming more and more complex. And maybe it is very much related to what was raised first. Let's understand what's going on there and connect that to policies and practices. Does it work? I would like to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. If I get it correctly, this also speaks to the question of that context matters, and that a certain programming can also contribute to excluding and people and exclusion. So to be frank, I see too many now in the room. So let's do the following. I read out the two questions that I have online left, and then we do a round of answers, and then 3 short, sharp questions from the floor here, and then we will end 5 minutes late, maybe. The 2 questions from the floor, online, are probably directed to Paddy, because you brought in artificial intelligence, but it might be a bit unfair to give him all the responsibility for it, because it's quite a broad question asking what the impact of artificial intelligence is on social cohesion in the context of social sustainability. And then a question for you, Paddy. What do you think about the discussions on creating a loss and damage fund under the climate COP that created much friction since the World Bank, this is not a question, this is first a comment, So discussions on creating a loss and damage fund created much friction since the World Bank and some large countries argued for hosting the fund at the World Bank. Countries of the Global South are worried about this. Can you comment on this? And I'd also like you to pick questions and also be as short as possible and as broad as necessary.
I mean, I can't really comment on that last question or comment, not because I feel that I'm restricted in doing so, but just because I don't really know anything about it. So, I mean, I have colleagues who work on the climate agenda and are much more aware of this, but I just read a little bit in the newspapers. I've got no idea what the thinking is, so apologies for that. Again, on the AI on social cohesion, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, right? I mean, I think the thing that's a little bit scary is none of us really understand this, and we don't know what the limits will be. And of course, the worrying thing is that, unlike, say, nuclear proliferation, it's going to be pretty difficult, I think, to get that kind of collective action for international agreements around this, because clearly this gives different countries and economies a competitive advantage if they are more liberal in allowing things to move forward without checks and balances. So it was interesting to see the EU and the US to some extent over the past few weeks thinking, and the conference in the UK, about how we regulate this, but it's going to be very, very difficult, right? And so what this leads to, who knows, right? And it's scary, I would say, from our side. But of course, if done well, it creates tremendous opportunities as well. So I mean, I guess rather than project any prediction on this, I'd just say it's important that at every level, including international policymakers and governments, through the UN or other means, are having these discussions about how to regulate this in a way that it has positive rather than negative effects. And then I think I could talk about the Middle East, but I think there's plenty of other expertise here on this as well. I think the first and the third questions were kind of similar, right, about the importance of context and of local or indigenous knowledge. And just to let you know, the social development part of the World Bank, which is where I work, initially set up as a result of A, structural adjustment gone wrong, and B, big dams that were displacing a lot of people. And there was an acknowledgement at the time that we needed to have a space within the organization to lead the agenda on participation, consultation, and giving communities ownership over their own futures, right? So that's where we come from ideologically. And so I mentioned earlier about the community and local driven development programs. It's $40 billion of active money. It's about 10% of what the World Bank does globally. And these are projects where communities are not just consulted, but have the final say over how the funds are used, and they design the projects together. So I think, of course, this is super important. And as with adaptation and mitigation work, this is going to be even more important. I'm not sure when you were talking about the indigenous people being displaced. I was talking to my colleague Diana, who leads up our global work on indigenous people yesterday, and she was telling me about the Kenyan forest indigenous people who are being kicked out. I think they're called the Ogiek or something. I'm sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong, who despite court resolutions are being kicked out of what is going to become a conservation zone and ecotourism, right? So we know the ways to do development better and to protect people's rights is to give them a proper stakehold in things. And so I think it's really, really important as we develop responses in all of these areas around climate, social cohesion, local development, that we bring in the diversity of community views. And that's something that personally I'm very committed to supporting in my career.
Who wants to go next? Jennifer, you, I don't know if you can just speak up or nod or make a sign, or the others just speak up.
Sure, I'll say.
Perfect.
I'll answer just very quickly on the questions about multipolarity, the multipolar world and the impact of the conflicts going on, and just a perspective from sitting here in the United States. Clearly, the world is dividing on many issues, and there's been an attempt to make this democracy versus authoritarian cleavage, which is a little bit messy. And also, I worry about it impeding our ability to have collective action on the things that we do need to agree on, climate change, et cetera. But when we look at the impact of polarization, both within the world, these divisions, and within a society, on our ability to address these, I think we can see clearly the effect on Biden and President Biden's leadership in both Ukraine and Middle East conflict, coming out very strong to build coalitions at the beginnings of those conflict. Even though there were global differences about those, obviously, but now the local polarization within the United States, the national divisions are beginning to manifest very clearly. It took longer on Ukraine, but it's now clear within the U.S. Congress, the divisions about providing further support to Ukraine, and that, of course, will affect President Biden's ability to try to bring in a global, to keep the global collective together. But I think one of the saddest things is with the Israel-Hamas conflict, the impact I'm seeing, and I'm not even commenting on what's happening in those countries, which is horrendous, but within the United States, really strongly growing polarization and fears. The social cohesion is being destroyed as both Muslim people and Jewish people are feeling scared and frightened. And the really sad thing is that these are two, historically discriminated against groups, two minority groups, who are now in conflict with each other over this. And I think this is just a horrendous situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We just agreed here on the panel that we would give the 3 questions that will be very short and sharp, the opportunity, and then we start with Joe and Heriberto for the answers and bring the others in again. So I saw Constanze and Armin and Ilke in the front.
Thank you. I'm Simona from UNSCC, also one of the neighbors here. And I'll be very short. The thing that resonated most with me was when Joseph started telling what is the consensus among many Africans in civil society, and that the supply side is missing. So the question that there is a consensus for democracy, but the supply side is missing. And I'm asking myself, is that only an African phenomenon, or is it a global phenomenon? You asked the question, what do we even mean by democracy? But I think 2 terms that I haven't heard during the discussion were power and justice. And I was going to say 3 rights, and then Heriberto brought in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the very end. But I do think if we talk about social cohesion and polarization and what are the things that are driving people apart, and we see it now as well in how the Israel-Hamas situation is being framed globally. I think that there is an elephant in the room that we have not addressed in terms of an honest conversation on power relations globally and how people feel about the overall mechanics and dynamics globally. And it's not sufficient to say we need to build capacity for people to understand democracy, etc. but to really interrogate where is this ill at ease sense coming, that people believe that the military would be an answer. And so it opened with Joseph's comment, but my question is, and I don't expect you to have the answer, do we have possibly the same supply side difficulty globally, and what do we actually mean when we talk about social cohesion in that sense? Thank you.
I mean, you can have the opportunity to give an example, however short.
Yeah, I will do my best. So thank you so much for all the insights. Really interesting discussion. My point is probably, it's addressed to everyone, but I guess Jennifer and Joe, the question would go to you. Patty at the beginning raised the issue of the concept of social cohesion. I just wanted to have a feeling on the empirical side, but also on the conceptual side, how much we expect these issues that we kind of measure, be it polarization, be it social cohesion, how volatile we expect them to be, and empirically how volatile or how much they change. Do they change quickly or not? And to have a sense of that, I think that's importantly to get a better idea of what we're talking about and what we want and can achieve, to have a better understanding of how these phenomena empirically work. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least.
Hi, I'm Milke. I'm representing Center for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development. We've been researching social cohesion with our methodology SCORE for the past 10 years. I wanted to highlight mental health and MHPSS programming and how it can be integral to social cohesion interventions, and it shouldn't be siloed as health intervention. It sits at the center of humanitarian development and peace-building nexus, especially when we're talking about polycrisis and how it deteriorates mental health and mental well-being outcomes and creates this vicious circle with trauma, SGBV, war, insecurity increasing, mental health, mental well-being decreasing, and that in turn leading to further deterioration of civic duty, livelihoods, social tolerance, and other maybe constructive civic attitudes. So where does this sit in, for instance, Afrobarometer's priorities of what we track on the continent in terms of outcomes? Where does it sit in terms of human security, and how can it be part of that human security concept or World Bank's intervention priorities?
Thank you. So that sounded like 2 or 3 perfect final questions for Joe and Heriberto, as they were about the concepts and empirical observations, and also about power and injustice. And then, given the time and that we're already over time, I would close the panel after this. I would have loved to have this last round, but I hope that we can continue this during the reception.
Thank you, and thank you all for your questions. So your last point, actually, Afrobarometer is going to add a couple of questions in this next survey round, talking about people's experiences and well-being in that context. And so to some extent, we're going to cover some elements of mental health and just people's feeling of anxiety about what is happening. So we're asking questions about, are you anxious about A, B, and C, and that would be coming out. Hopefully, by the beginning of next year, we'll have some data coming out from some of the countries. But as of now, we haven't tracked it yet. But that's something that we're working on. In terms of how rapidly some social cohesion measures change, I think in some cases they do change very rapidly, because when insecurity situations change, which can change in a twinkle of an eye, often people begin to hold back, especially when it comes to non-social trust. So it just depends on the dimension that you're talking about. Of course, the vertical dimensions are more sticky, but the horizontal dimensions can be very, very volatile. And the last point I'll make is about these global conflicts and how they are impacting people, especially in Africa. We do have issues of poverty and inflation. Once the Ukraine war started, these have been big concerns, and we've seen that in Africa, When we used to ask people, what is the most important problem you want your government to address? Unemployment is always on top, followed by health and education. Management of the economy was never even in the top 5. But the last survey round, the management of the economy moved to second place, almost at par with unemployment, which was probably driven by the effects of COVID-19, but also the war in Ukraine, which caused inflation across the continent to a large extent. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Heriberto.
Thank you. 3 brief points about mental health. We have been trying to better understand. There are some challenges from the point of view of the data, but some of the surveys can give us an indication of what's going on. So we document how the level of stress reported by people have been increasing very significantly over the last decade, even before COVID, and then they strengthen after COVID. People are feeling sadder. And this is very significant. It's a jump of around 10 percentage point over the last decade. So there is a serious problem in our view, and we are trying to improve our way of tracking it. Second point about Simona's question, we have been exploring it, some of those dynamics for other countries and in the world, and in general we see the same type of pattern. So in general, high support to democracy, but at the same time, an increase in preferences for very strong leaders who don't bother to consult with the parliament, or the openness to an army rule. So this is very worrying. The interesting thing is that even though we can associate it with a problem in supply, it becomes an issue of demand, because this is what people then vote and in some cases or support. At the same time, we see that there is a problem of justice, distribution of power that is generating a lot of frustration, and this is across the board. And we think that this is something that is understudied. So the problems are bigger than what we think. Let me give you an example linked to gender inequality. So part of the theory is that by closing gaps, let's say in education, that is gonna close gaps in human capital, and therefore it's gonna close gaps in economic empowerment, and that is not happening. So it's yet another example of a theory that is not working, and therefore it's generating frustration. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to stop here. Yeah.
Thank you. We actually are over time already. So I think it became very obvious that we identify a lot of shared problems. We have ideas for shared solutions. We didn't have them all tonight, but so bad news is time is over. We won't find them tonight. But the good news is that we have 1.5 days left to discuss it and find more solutions, probably, or at least how to address all these complex problems. As researchers, of course, we like to hear that issues are under-researched and that we are needed. But now we want to invite you to a reception that you will find upstairs with some drinks and finger food. For those of you who will be with us during the conference, we will start tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the IDOS premises, and this leads me to extend a big thank you to all of you who traveled and have terrible overnight flights that made you arrive this morning. So thank you very much for bearing with us and being so sharp presenters and panelists. And of course, we shouldn't leave without extending a big thank you to a very professional and very polite crew of technicians who made this possible. Thank you. So, Have a good evening and enjoy the reception.